Okay, so hi everyone, and we'll continue with our discussion on loops. So, if you remember in the previous class, this is what we did, right? So far we've learned about the basic data types, and like we learned about strings, we learned about integer, float, boolean, yes. So now we learn to loop through a string, okay? Moving forward, we will learn about more complex data structures of Python, like lists and tuples. Those are collection data types. I'll talk about it. Okay. And then we'll come back to loops again to see how we can loop through those complex collection data types. For now, we'll use strings to understand loops. Okay. And
Okay, ma'am.
just give me a moment. Let me just get my annotation device. Okay, just before we continue our discussion with continue our discussion about loops, I just want to give you a brief idea about the collection data types. Okay, when I say collection, okay, what does it mean? It's a collection of things. What things? So those things could be integers or strings or a collection in themselves. It's like, see, when we declared a number, what suppose you had a variable holding on or referring to a value 20. Okay. So now this is an integer data type, right? If you print the type of A, it'll give you, it'll just tell you that this is class integer. Or if you put a decimal number, you will get an output that this is a float.
Float. Yes, ma'am.
If you have something like this as the value,
Boolean.
then yeah, this is a boolean. Or if you have something in double quotes or single quotes or
String.
triple quotes,
String.
it's string, right? So you can use this inbuilt function type, and here you can provide the variable name, and it outputs the data type of, depending on what data this variable contains. Okay, so this is just a single piece of information, right? Just a boolean, a single piece of information. What if I wanted to store multiple pieces of information? For example, I have a class of 20 students. Okay. If I wanted to record and store the performance of all these 20 students in a test, okay, let's say a programming test, which was like out of 100 marks. So now how do I store the marks of 20 students? Like so far with what we have learned, you would think of creating 20 variables for one variable each for each student and store their marks in each of these variables, right? That's one way.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, right. So once we learn about the collection data types, there is a way where you can group all these 20 numbers, which is the individual marks of 20 students, into something like an almirah where each rack holds the marks of one student, and you can assign this collection. This is what a collection looks like. Okay, it's like multiple pieces of information grouped together, and you can reference this multiple pieces of information by just one variable name. So if I just name that variable marks, and we learn much more about it, how to declare it, how to record data into it, how to store it, how to read data from it, or how to modify data. We'll learn all about it later. For now, I just want you to get an idea about what a collection means, when because I'll keep using that name. So it just gives you a way to store multiple pieces of data together. And now instead of having 20 different variables, you can just have one variable, and you can name these this. So imagine this to be like an almirah. Okay. So, and the racks are numbered with these numbers, which are called index numbers. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Goes up to 19 because we have 20 values. And now if I wanted to read the information in a particular rack in this almirah, what I would do is I will just use this variable name. So instead of just using the variable name, like in the case of integer, boolean, or string, we would just use the variable name, right? here, instead of just using the variable name, I will, because this variable holds one almirah of information, right? 20 racks, 20 different pieces of information, where each piece of information is the marks obtained by a student. So if I just want to read the marks of a specific student, I would specify this rack number, which is the index number. So if I just specify 2 here, it will give me whatever marks is stored here. Okay, so this would give me an output 80. So this is a collection data type. Okay, so we'll be learning about various of such collection data types. There is list, there is tuple, there is set, there is dictionary. And then once, if you're storing multiple data pieces together, and if I just wanted to do some processing, for example, let's say, okay, I conducted the test and students got marks out of 100. Now I want to give them grades based on what marks they got. Okay, so anything above 80, I want them to be assigned grade A. Anywhere between 60 to 80 is grade B. Anywhere between 40 to 60 is grade C, and anything lower than that is grade D. Okay, so if I just want to convert that to grade, what I would want to do is I would want to read this rack of almirah of information, one rack by one rack. Okay, and so I would want to read rack 1, which is marked 0, index 0, and see if whether it's greater than 80, or whether it's in the range of 60 to 80 or 40 to 60 or less than 40, and accordingly modify the contents of this rack with either of these options, right? If this was 70, then this falls into the category of grade B. So I would want to read this information and see which category it falls into, and then accordingly modify it to B. Okay, like this here should be modified to A. So for such an operation, I would need to read each rack one by one. That is what I call looping through a data type. Okay, it's like doing the same operation repeatedly. So each time I want to read one rack and see which range the marks falls into and modify it. And then I want to repeat the same set of steps for each of these racks. So I want to loop through these steps. So I want these set of steps. What these steps are: read the marks in that particular rack, identify which category it falls into, whether it's less than 40 or 40 to 60 or 60 to 80 or 80 to 100, and then modify accordingly with either of these characters. And these steps are to be repeated how many times?
20.
20 times, right? Because there are 20 marks, right, for 20 students. So I want these to be repeated 20 times. So my number of iterations is 20. I want to iterate 20 times. And in each iteration, I need to read a specific rack of this collection data type. Now we learn about these collection data types later on, but we've already learned about strings. So we can understand looping using strings, since strings are stored as a collection data type. So even though we did not learn about strings initially as a collection, but the way Python stores it is actually a collection of characters. So for example, this string here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 characters, right? So it is stored like this, similar to what we were discussing here. So now since there are 10 characters, so this would have like 10 racks. In each rack, the content is just a character and it's indexed. So I can read a specific character using the index number. Okay, and the indexing number, so if there are 10 characters, the indexing will go on up to 9 because the counting starts from 0. So now if the variable was called name, okay, so if I just print name, it will print this entire content. Okay, it will print the entire word Bedrock for AI. But if I just wanted to read the content of a specific rack in this Almira or array of characters, then I would specify the rack number here, which is the index number. So if I say 3 here, then add 3, we have R. So this will give me the character R. Okay. So now if I just want to do some operation, I want to read each character and do some manipulation, maybe just print it. So I need to, okay, so if I need to read each character of this string and do some manipulation on it or something as basic as just printing it on screen, then how many iterations do I need? If there are 10 characters in the string, so how many iterations would I need if I want to read one character each time and do some processing using that?
Ma'am, 10.
Ma'am, 10.
10 iterations,
10.
right? Okay, so okay, so in Python programming language, the way we declare and define these number of iterations, or okay, so we have some processing. Let's say these are some lines of 3 lines of code where these 3 lines of code somehow get the character dynamically. Okay, each time these 3 lines of code are executed, depending on which iteration it is, it gets that character. So if it was first iteration, it gets the character B here. If it was second iteration, it gets the character E here. And then these lines are again based on what character is read here. Suppose in each iteration, okay, let's take a example. Actually, it will be easier to understand. Okay, forget about the syntax for now. Just understand it in plain English. So let's say if what we wanted to do is we have a variable char, and we wanted this variable to be assigned the value of the character at a specific index in each iteration. So depending on the iteration number, I want this character to be assigned. So if it is iteration number 0, which is the first iteration, okay, if it's the first iteration, I wanted to hold the first character. If it is second iteration, I wanted to hold the second character. This should happen dynamically, and that's because it happens dynamically. This value is not fixed. Okay, so I'm storing it in a variable, and then I have 2 more lines of code which just use this variable name. So it doesn't matter what value the variable is holding, because my other lines of code just use the variable name. So they will, let's say the next line of code is just to print the character. So whatever value this variable holds, this line is just going to print it. And let's have another line. The current character is, and it just prints again the character. So there are 2 print statements. Okay, just to keep it simple, you can do more advanced processing. Maybe you can have some logic, something like if the character is a vowel, do something. If it's not a vowel, do something else. If it is a character B, then do some further processing or replace this character by another character, whatever. You could have any processing here. Just to keep it simple, I'm just printing here, but these print statements are also not static prints, right? Each time we are using this variable, and the contents of variable is what is going to be printed here. So how the output of these 2 statements is dependent on what this variable holds. So I want these 3 lines to be executed 10 times because there are 10 characters. And in each iteration, I want this variable to hold the character dependent on the iteration number. If it is iteration number 1, hold this character. If it is iteration number 2, hold this character, and so on. So how I would implement it in Python is using the for loop. So for just tells me, there are, okay, there is one variation of for which I will cover later. For now, I'll use the range function. So I can specify the number of iterations using this keyword called for. So I would just say that for count, okay, I can use any name here. So this is just a variable name for index in, and I use a inbuilt function called range. What range does is I can just specify, the number of iterations. So the basic version of range function is just specify the stop count here. So if I just write 10 here, it just means that whatever lines of code that I have here, okay, just let me just clear up some space. Okay, you're aware of the indentation in Python, right? So everything needs to be indented well. Now I am trying to define a loop, and for Python to understand the number of statements, the specific statements which need to be executed in each iteration by an indentation. So all those statements which I want Python to execute in each iteration have to follow this indentation. They start from here, with the stat space. If I write a statement starting here, this statement is not considered part of the loop. So now what this piece of code does is, since I've specified range 10, it just means that 10 iterations are to be done, okay? In each iteration, all these lines of code will be executed. And one more thing is that in each iteration, this variable, and I can use any variable name here. I can put I, count, index, character, and anything, it just needs to be descriptive. So this variable will hold on to the count of iteration. In this case, it will, the counting, since I want 10 iterations, the counting starts from 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 9. So in iteration number 1, index will have value 0. In iteration number 2, index will have value 1, and then 2, and so on. Let me show you this same code in a Python editor using debug. Okay, just give me a moment. I'm just starting my Python editor. It will take a minute to launch. Okay, I'm just creating a Python file here. I'm going to put the code here. Let's say if we just write something as simple as for index in range 10, right? So this statement just tells me that, whatever lines of code that I have with this indentation, those lines of code should be executed 10 times. In each iteration, all the lines are executed. So I'll keep the code simple here. Let's say each time I just specify that this is iteration number, and I'm just printing the value that this variable holds. Okay, so this is just a variable name. Remember, you can use any name here. Okay, doesn't matter. But I would want to use something which indicates the exact use of this variable. So if I'm using it like an index of a string, then I would prefer to use the name index. If I'm using it like a counter, I would prefer using the name count. If I'm using it to hold the value of a character or an element, I would use a name char or element. So it depends on what is the use of this variable. Accordingly, you can name it. Usually people just name it as I, but I would not recommend that. Okay, so let's have one more line of code. What should we print now? Let's say we print add 20 to the index. Okay, and what should it do? It should just add 20 to the current value of index and print it. Okay. So if I just run this code, I can see the output here. Okay, I haven't added the debug configuration. It's still running the main and not this. So I need to add a configuration here. Python 3.8 is fine. Okay, fine. Now then let's run this. Okay, so this is what it is doing. So in each iteration, so look at this, the iteration number is, now we'll debug it. So now, right now I've just run the code. This is something which, this is the output that you will also get in Python notebook. But the advantage of using an editor is we can actually debug easily line by line. Okay, so this is what it does. In each iteration, these two lines are executed. Okay, so notice this space because I have had, put a space here. There is no space here. So you can see the difference here. There is, the space is also printed each time. So these two lines are printed in each iteration. And how many iterations have been done in this loop?
10.
10.
Right. So the last one has iteration number 9, right? Because this range, so there are 3 variations of range. This is the most basic variation where I just provide the stop value. Like where should the iteration stop? It will stop at 10, meaning because the counting starts from 0, so it will actually go on to a value just 1 less than whatever this is. If this is 10, it will go until 9. But it will be actually 10 iterations because the counting has started from 0. So 0 to 9. Now let's debug it. Let's look. So I can put this is called a breakpoint. Okay. Now when I debug it, I'm actually controlling the execution. Now only when I tell Python to go to the next line, it will go to the next line. So we are at first iteration. You can see the value of index here. The value of index is 0. Okay, if I go to the next line, now this line has been printed. Okay, because I am printing it. So the print is shown in the console. So right now I just have this printout. Only the first line has been executed. Okay. Now if I go to the next line, now second line has also been printed. Now my first iteration is over. So the execution has gone back to this for loop. And now, so Python is actually doing a lot of work for you. In other programming languages, you would have to actually tell the compiler to increment this number and then move forward with the loop. Here Python makes it really easy. So internally this index is incremented on its own. We don't do anything about it. We just specify the stop value and it automatically increments index every time. So now we are in the second iteration. And notice the value of index. What is the value of index now?
1.
It's 1. Okay. So it's printed. This is the second iteration. So these two lines were executed in the second iteration. Now we are here at the third iteration. So the moment I press next, this line would have been executed, and which after this line has been executed, the value of index would be updated. Index would have a value 2. Okay, you can notice that here. And now again, these two lines will be executed. These two lines do nothing more than just printing some values. Okay, and so on. So this will continue for 10 iterations. Okay, now let's do some modification to the code. Let's say now I write a line here. How many times would you see this printout if I run this code?
Ma'am, 1.
1, right? because in each iteration only these two lines will be executed, because these two are what are considered to be in part of for loop because of the indentation. This line does not have the indentation, so it is not considered part of the for loop. So in Java, you used to use brackets to specify what is the content of the loop, but Python would understand it using indentation. So all the lines that follow this indentation are considered part of the loop. And the moment you come out of this indentation, that's outside the loop. Okay, and there are three variations of range function. So this is the simplest one where you just provide the stop count, where to stop. You can also specify where to start. By default, it starts from 0, right? But I can specify where to start from. I can say that, start from 5. Now what would it do? How many iterations would it do? Let's see. Think about it. Let me know how many iterations it would do. What do you think?
5.
Yeah, it will start from 5. The first count, instead of 0, now it will start from 5. So there'll be index will have value 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, then 9. It is always 1 less than this value. Okay, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's 5. Okay, got this? And the third variation of range function is, okay, sorry, I accidentally moved it. Okay, the third variation is so by default, this index is incremented by 1 each time, right? I can also change the step size. So the default step size is 1. The only mandatory part is the stop count. The start and step are optional. So you can, if you wanted to start from something other than 0, you can specify that here. And if you want the step size to be something other than 1, for example, if I specify the step size as 2, now what would happen is index will have a value 5. And then in the next round, instead of 6, it will have a value 7. So index will be 5, then 7, and then 9. And it will not go on to 11 because the stop is at 10. So it has to stop 1 less than 10. Now let's see what it does. Okay, so this index is 5, and then 7, and then 9. What if this was 9? Now what would happen to index?
Ma'am, it will print just 5 and 7.
Yes.
Right, exactly. Because it can go only up to 1 less than 9, right? So it will not go up to 9. So it will just go from 5 and 7. Okay, great. Now we can use this same thing to read characters from a string, because string, using strings, you are actually storing characters. String is nothing but an array of characters, okay, which is indexed. So you can read characters at a specific index. So let's see how we loop through a string and read characters at specific index. Let's go back to our Jupyter notebook because we already have all the code there, or we can copy the code here. Okay, so I am hoping that this variation, and this is all clear. So the step size, so you can also go backwards, right? Here it starts from 9, goes up to 2, and each time the step is -3. So it would be like 9, then 6, then 3, okay? Something like this. So you can specify any start. The first argument is start, then stop, then step. Now let's use this range function to loop through a string. So here what we do is, okay, so if I wanted to read each character of a string, the number of iterations should be the length of the string, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Inside the range function, I can either count I can actually manually count the number of characters and write 10 here because there are 10 characters. Or if I don't want to hard code it because, this variable may have some other name, So instead of hard coding, I can use this length function of string, and I can just say that whatever is the length of this string, just provide that number as the stop count. Okay. Just makes the program more dynamic. Okay, now how many iterations would I have? Considering that the name refers to this value, and this string has 10 characters. So how many times would this for loop iterate? How many iterations would be there? The count of it.
10 iterations.
10 iterations, right? And in each iteration, what am I doing? I'm just executing one statement. In each iteration, this is just one statement which is being executed. And what do I do in this statement? This is the variable name, and I'm specifying the index inside square brackets. So what does this do? What does this return? If in the first iteration, what will be the value of index? 0, right? Because
Yes.
I'm specifying only the stop count here. I've not specified start. So, if I just rewrite this statement, instead of using length, this is similar to for index in range. What will
10.
this return? This returns 10 for this value, right? So this is similar to this statement. So in each iteration, index will hold on to values ranging from 0 to 9.
9.
In the first iteration, index holds a value 0. So in iteration number 1, what I'm doing is print name 0, right? And what would be the output of this read? So I'm reading the character of string referred to by variable name at index 0. It's like the name refers to this array of characters, and I am now reading the character at index 0, right? So what would be printed?
B.
B.
Ma'am, B will be printed 10 times.
Are you sure? In the second iteration, what would happen? What would I have here in the second iteration?
Ma'am, E.
Yes,
Ma'am, next iteration.
because I've not hard coded 0 here, right? I have put the variable name here. So this value is going to change in each iteration.
Yes, ma'am.
So in the first iteration, index is 0, but in the second iteration, what is the value of index?
1.
1.
Right. So in the second iteration, you are printing something like this, which refers to E.
Yes, ma'am.
And in the third iteration,
B. B.
right? Okay. So this is okay. So we have not hard coded it. Now this print changes depending on the iteration number. Let's run this code and see what it does. Okay, you see this? So it iterates through, and we specified the stop count depending on the length of the string. So the number of iterations are exactly the same as the number of characters in the string. If I do a +1 here, what would happen?
I'm outside the loop.
Yes, it would give me an error, and that error would be, so now what I'm trying to do is, in the length of this string is 10, so I'm actually telling Python to loop through 11 times, right? And my stop count is 10 plus 1, which is 11. So the last value, so this will go on fine till index holds a value 9, it will work fine. Now I'm invoking this code something like, now what this becomes is for index in range 11, right? Because this length function returned 10, and then I'm doing +1, so this becomes 11. So there will be 11 iterations. In the 10th iteration, index will hold a value 10, right? And I would be printing name at index 10, which will give me an output I. So this works fine. But in the 11th iteration, okay, sorry, index is 9, not 10. Okay, in the 11th iteration, because the counting started from 0, in the 11th iteration, the last iteration, index will hold a value 10, right? And this print statement will expect, it will try to read this from the string. It will try to read the character at index 10, and there is nothing at index 10 because the indexing ends here. This is the last index. So this line would actually result in an error because the string ranges from index 0 to 9. You know, this is the range of the indexing of this array of characters. Got this?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So now we would be trying to read something which is beyond this range of indexing. And our error will exactly indicate that. Let's see what the error reads. It's so important to understand the meaning of errors. Okay, and the errors are actually quite explanatory. See, string index out of range. So what this means is now we are trying to read out of the range of possible index. Our indexing was only from 0 to 9, but we are trying to read beyond that. So that's the error that we get. So obviously that is why we don't hard code here. We just use this length function. So it will exactly go to, use the right number of iterations. Okay, the other way, so this is how you can use range function and for loop to read character by character from a string. The other way, which is an easier way, which we will be using more frequently with not just string. So string is a collection data type, which is a collection of characters. And we will learn about the few more types of collections, which will be again, which will not be just a collection of characters, but it can be more than that. It can be a collection of strings, collection of numbers, collection of collections. Okay, so in all those cases, Python gives you a very easy way to read through collections. So instead of using the range function, I hope everybody understood the usage of range function, the start, stop, and step size.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. I'm just going to clear this so that it looks more readable. Okay, where was I? Yeah, here. So the easier way that Python provides to loop through any collection is this. What you can do is you just write for and you specify a variable name here. Again, this is anything of your choice depending on what that variable is going to hold. And here you provide the name of the variable, which is a collection data type variable. Okay, so it can be a string, list, tuple, dictionary, set, any of the collection data types. So in our example, we have this variable called name, which is the collection data type. And what is the collection? It's a collection of characters. So I specify this name. So what I'm specifying to Python is loop through this collection data type. Okay. And in each iteration, depending on how many elements, so if it's a collection, I call each rack. So remember that Almira example. So each rack is an element. Okay. So in this case, since it has 10 characters, so I can say there are 10 racks, which I could read using indexing, or I could say it has 10 elements. Fine. So I want this loop to be done 10 times, 10 iterations. So I specified here, I have specified the number of iterations using range function. So instead of doing that, Python will automatically understand collection data type. So I can just specify the variable name here. And if it's a string, it will, the internal implementation of Python understands that, okay, fine, let me see what this variable refers to. Okay, it's a string value. So let me see how many characters are there in that string. So it is automatically doing it for you. You don't have to specify that. You don't have to use the length function. You don't have to use the range function. So it automatically knows that, okay, through the internal implementation, of course, that this variable name points to a string and this string has 10 characters. So I should be looping 10 times. Okay. And in each iteration, whatever variable name that you put here will hold on to an element. Like in this case, we are looping through an array of characters, okay, which is a string. So in each iteration, this variable will hold a value of a character. So I can use the variable name accordingly because this variable is going to hold the value of a character in each iteration. So let me use char as the variable name. So what this would do is, for character in name, print character. Okay. So first of all, this will go through 10 iterations because this variable is a collection data type, has 10 elements. Okay. Each element is a character in this case. And in each iteration, this variable holds the value of a specific element. In first iteration, it holds the value of element 0, which is the character at index 0. In the second iteration, it holds a value of character at index 1 and so on. Let's run this code. Okay, so this will give me similar output as this, but this looks much readable. Oops, okay. Oh, I restarted the kernel and then I haven't run this cell. So Python does not recognize what this variable name is. Okay, because this is the first cell that I ran just now. Okay, so I'll need to run this cell as well, or I can just copy this statement because I don't want this printout. I'll just copy this statement here and then run it. Okay, did you understand the difference between these two? They both do the same thing, but this is an easier way of achieving the same objective. Is this clear to everyone? You can try writing this code, then obviously with practice, it will be more clear. But conceptually, were you able to understand? See, in here, I am using the range function and I'm specifying the start, stop, and step. This is an easier way that Python has provided for all collection data types. So as long as my data type is a collection, string is also considered a collection because it's a collection of characters. Now I don't have to specify the start, stop, or anything. As long as this variable is a collection data type, Python will automatically, know using, the internal implementation is developed in such a way that it will be able to identify what type of collection data type this is and how many elements does this collection data type have. In this case, if it's a string, the number of elements is nothing but the number of characters, right? Each character being an element. So, so depending on how many elements this collection data type has, the number of iterations will be exactly same as that. So if it has 10 elements, then there will be 10 iterations. And in each iteration, this variable will hold on to the value of an element. In the first iteration, it holds on to the first element. In the second iteration, it holds on to the second element. And what is the first element in this case?
B.
Right. And what is the last element?
I.
Yes. So when I run this, each time I'm just printing the value of this variable, and this variable is holding on to an element in each iteration. So I get this printout. I'm printing each character one by one. Okay. So this is the same output as we got here. This is just another way of writing the same loop, but this looks much simpler and much more readable. And you will be mostly using this because this works for all collection data types. This is definitely easier. But in case you wanted to use the index number, if you wanted the count also to be, kept track of because you had to use it for some processing, your code required the counter number, the iteration number, then you could use this format of for loop. Or you could also, in that case, if you really wanted the count, you could initialize a count variable and in each iteration update the count to count plus 1. Okay, so here you could also print the iteration number. You could just specify that. Okay, iteration number is equal to nothing but the count. Okay. So now what would happen is, oh shit, I rewrote the same statement. Okay, I didn't want to do that. Okay, let's print the character also. See, so each time I'm also keeping track of the iteration number. So you can still use the same loop format and keep track of the iteration number, or you could use this format because here this variable is holding on to the iteration number, right? Because we are using range, each time index is holding a value starting from 0 to up to 1 less than this. So depending on what kind of logic you wanted to implement, what was the requirement, you will use one of these loops. This is more commonly used because this looks neater, right? Easier. So if you wanted to keep track of count and use this type of loop, you can have another variable to keep track of count. Okay, I think we will stop here because I want you to spend time absorbing this information and practicing it. There is still some more content which I wanted to cover, but it's okay. We'll cover it in the next class. And so we'll cover the remaining part of for loop in the next class. And we will also go through while loop. Okay, so in for loop, you are actually looping based on the number of iterations you wanted, right? The other requirement could be where you want to loop based on a condition, keep doing this until this condition is true, something like that. Until the bucket is full, keep putting water into it. So that's the second type of looping based on condition, which we'll cover in the next class. And we have been, so right now we are learning about loops using strings. Later on, we'll come back to for loop and while loop again when we learn about more data types in Python, and we'll see how we can loop through those data types. Okay, so we'll come back to for loop again, but again, syntax wise, it is going to be something similar. The only thing that is going to change is this variable here. Now this is a string, then it will be some other data type. And then based on what data type it is, you can do different types of processing on that data. Okay, so I would strongly advise you to practice this code. I'll share this file with you. You can try all this code, even though we have not discussed the latter part of the file. We'll do that in the next class. But at least, but I'll be sharing this code also with you. So if you want, you can go through and maybe, practice it. Hopefully you'll be able to understand this one on your own. But in any case, we'll be discussing it in the next class. But do practice what we have already discussed and go through this video of the previous class. I'll be uploading today's class video also. But all the content that is covered in this file has been discussed in this class. It's already available on YouTube. Okay, please go through that before the next class. So next class we can complete the discussion on loops and then move forward with other data types. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, then we'll stop the class here and I'll see you next week. Okay, any questions?